Okay, ladies and gentlemen, to interrupt you, I'm very pleased to welcome the first Badaro Talks of this autumn term, and we have also audience online. My name is Susanne Dahlgren, and I'm the director of the Finnish Institute here. And I have the pleasure to introduce our rather new scholar here, whose name is Dr. Joanna Töyräänvuori. No, repeat. So she has PhD from the University of Helsinki, and she has two docentships, adjunct professorships from Finnish universities in both ancient Near Eastern studies and in cultural history studies. She has studied both history, cultural heritage and literature, and she's specialized in particular on the late Bronze Age, and in reading in particular about the language and culture of the Ugarit. Sorry, I always make this mistake. I'm an anthropologist. Sorry. So, and this, of course, you all know that this used to be a very lively trading city in the Mediterranean, which then suddenly disappeared. So the title of her talk today is Late Bronze Age System Collapse on the Eastern Mediterranean, Lessons from History. So, Joanna, please.
Thank you. So it's very nice to see you, and it is very nice that I'm actually able to see you, that we have light here, and everyone online too. It's great that you're here. So I'm going to start with some pretty basic concepts now, because I'm sure that even if some of you know this topic very well, not everyone is going to be familiar with this. So I'll start with this concept and then move on to more specific things. And the president of Finland actually has this saying that you have to have 3 points in your talk. So I'm going to have 3 points today. I'm going to talk about the Eastern Mediterranean as a part of this world system in the late Bronze Age. I'm going to talk about the collapse of this world system and the effects it had on the Eastern Mediterranean. And then finish off, we'll think about how the Eastern Mediterranean in the Bronze Age might be analogous to the modern day. And I'm inviting you to also think about this while we go on. But to begin with, some basic concepts. So what do we even mean by the Eastern Mediterranean? It seems so obvious that it's the eastern part of the Mediterranean, but there are many different ways to define it, obviously. And it always requires some delineating. So we choose something in and we often choose something out. So we make choices when we talk about this concept. So in the context of the late Bronze Age, the Eastern Mediterranean is usually seen as such. So that the coastal areas from Greece to ancient Egypt and the islands. And these areas during the late Bronze Age were divided into roughly 3 spheres. And these used to be called like cultural areas, but they're not very good descriptions of it. So there are these 3 major areas, and they're seen as somehow separate, but we're not completely sure like what the thing is that separates these areas. So they're not really separated by geography. They're not really separated by ethnic or linguistic or even political grounds. And actually, the one thing that these 3 areas had, like the difference between them was that they only used individual scripts for writing. So each of them had different systems of writing, but during this time in the late Bronze Age, they all communicated with a script that was foreign to all of them. So even though all of these areas had their own ways of writing, they communicated with each other using this common script that came from the outside. And then the late Bronze Age. What do we mean by the Bronze Age? traditionally, we've divided history in these ages or eras based on the primary material used for working and tools and making weapons of war. So we have the Stone Age, Paleolithic and Neolithic, the older and the younger Stone Age, Chalcolithic being the Copper Age, then we have the Bronze Age and the Iron Age. And this way of categorizing these eras is actually based on a Danish historian, Christian Thomsen, who in the late 1900s decided to take the objects they had in the Danish National Museum and put them into order. So he categorized these objects in the Danish Museum into Stone Age, Copper Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age, and so on. And we just use this way of dividing history now. And it's possible that he even based this way of dividing history into Hesiod's Metal Ages. But Hesiod obviously started from the Golden Age and then came down from there. So he sort of flipped this very traditional way of viewing history. Bronze Age is divided further into 3 different eras, so the early, middle, and Bronze Age. And if you were here in the spring for the last Badaro talk by my colleague Nina Maranen, she was talking about the Middle Bronze Age, and I'm talking about the Late Bronze Age, so I'm bringing us a little bit closer to the modern age. But the use of bronze in talking about this era is not actually arbitrary, because it was the spread of bronze casting technology that really created this interconnected world system. So it's very crucial for how the world became like this in the Bronze Age, because making bronze requires the smelting of 2 metals, copper and tin. And the thing is that they are not found in the same areas. As you can see from the map, copper was pretty abundant in this area of the world, roughly Europe and West Asia. But tin was much more rare, and the sources of tin were far removed from these places where they did find copper. So if you want to put the 2 things together, copper and tin, then you need trade. You need this far distance trade with places, and you need cooperation. You need to work together with people to be able to make bronze. And bronze was obviously superior to copper because it is harder. So copper is soft metal, and when they invented how to make this harder metal, it became worth it to cooperate with people across long distances to find this better material for doing weapons of war, but also tools for agriculture and for doing all kinds of things. And this requirement of trading across distance also led to the formation of a trade network. So because they started trading these 2 very important metals, it led to trading other things, both raw materials and then products that have been ready-made. So this required alliances. Here you can see where we have tin. So we've got copper pretty much all over. The major sources for tin at this time were in Spain and in Afghanistan. So a lot of the tin was brought to the Eastern Mediterranean from Afghanistan. And Cyprus, who maybe gets its name from copper or the other way around, was a major source of copper in this area. So somewhere on the Mediterranean coast next to Cyprus was the perfect spot for making bronze, because you'd have both metals brought there. But it's not just the Eastern Mediterranean. This is an actual world system that was created in the Bronze Age. And these trade relations, they reached pretty far and wide in the ancient world. And even though the contact between these different places was a lot slower than it is today, it was the manufacture of bronze that facilitated the formation of this network. And it is a world system, so when this interconnected system of different areas collapses, it had wide-reaching consequences, because there was this domino effect. So when a a system is like very dependent on different parts working together. When one part falls, then they all start falling. So when we talk about the late Bronze Age world, we're often referring to the Eastern Mediterranean in particular, and to lesser extent Mesopotamia, because these were the major players or great powers or whatever we call them during this era. Colors are not showing very brightly here, but what like separated these areas was that they all of them had a great king, someone who they called a great king, and then these great kings were in contact with each other. And there was a sort of fiction that when the kings like gave gifts to each other, it was actually like trade. So it was a very business-like relationship that was disguised into this like gift giving and like being polite, but really they were like doing business with each other. The three areas, the Aegean, the Anatolian area where the Hittite Empire was, and Egypt, which had an empire at this time, were the major players. But then in Mesopotamia, we had Kassite Babylonia, we had Assyria was rising at this time, and then there was a Mitanni Empire. So they also were a part of this world system, but they were a little peripheral. So the things were happening, especially here between the Hittites and the Egyptians. So they were like the two major players. So if we compare this to the era of the Cold War, they would have been like the United States and the Soviet Union of the year. I'm not saying which is which, you can decide for yourself, but it's an enough. So the late Bronze Age was like mostly characterized by this international system of great powers. National is a bit of a difficult word here, so I sometimes like use interregional, but it is a very arbitrary term. And it was characterized by these trade relationships, by diplomatic correspondence. So all of these areas were in correspondence with each other. They sent letters, and not just the kings, but like private individuals also sent letters during this era. They had a common language. So in addition to having this script that they all wrote together, there was the Akkadian language, which was something that all of them used as a foreign language, but that they could use to communicate with each other. They exchanged raw materials and consumer products, and they shared, especially among elite, a culture. So the elite material culture, like their clothes and art and things like that, were very similar across this whole area. And there were trends, obviously, that like spread across this area. And they might have done it slower than they do today, but they still like managed to permeate this whole area. And it's characterized by a wealth of literary production. So there's a lot of ancient texts that have been discovered from this era that's made it possible to reconstruct the political history of this era. And the question is, how is this analogous to the modern world? So some people want to see like obvious analogies, and other people are a bit more hesitant to see common features between them. A scholar called Eric Klein has named these the G7 or G11 countries of the era. So these were the major players, and I'm sorry that you cannot see all of this, but on Zoom, I think they can see the whole slide. And what might be similar to the modern day from the Bronze Age is that there were a lot of like new technologies invented during this era. There were technological innovations. There was this population explosion, probably caused by this invention of new technology, led to better crop yields, led to population growing and so on. Plus economic growth, there was multilateral trade. So it means that there wasn't just like two parties who would trade with each other, but there was a complicated trade network. So you might sell raw materials somewhere, and then they would do something with raw materials if they got from elsewhere, and then make a product and then sell it somewhere else. So it was very complicated trade. During this era, there was increased urbanization. So we have more and more cities around this time. The bureaucracies of these cities in place, and there was a kind of an internet here. So they did exchange packets of information with these pay tablets. So it is a much slower version of an internet, but it did function. They were able to exchange information between these areas, and there were widespread art and fashion trends, especially among the elite. So, like Susanna mentioned at the start, my speciality, the kingdom of Ugarit, it's one of the reasons we actually know so much about this era, as we do know comparably a lot about this era. So some of the eras that come after this are less familiar to us than the late Bronze Age. And it is just from this city in Syria called Ugarit, we found a lot of evidence. So we have material culture, but also a lot of texts, especially private letters written by people that are very important for the reconstruction of this world system. And what makes Ugarit so important is that it was in connection to pretty much all the parts of this world system. So even though it is just one place, it is one site, archaeological site. It is still like it gives us a much broader picture of this area because it was in such contact with these other areas. So there are texts, but also like material culture in the city tells us that it was in connection with the other parts of this world. And we have many different types of texts that were found there, from economic and legal texts to private and economic correspondence, and especially the queens, it seems, were in this diplomatic correspondence with other queens in this area. And the kingdom actually consisted of several different, like smaller cities and villages. So it's not just one city in Ugarit, it was an actual kingdom. And it had like over 100 smaller cities and villages. And it had 4 major harbors because sea trade was what they did best. So the sea trade connected them to different parts of this late Bronze Age world. And here are some of the objects that we found. This is part of the leafware. So these are very international. So for example, these alabaster vases have been found pretty much all over this world system. So art trends were widespread at this time. And Ugarit is especially important because some of the final texts that we have from the late Bronze Age have been discovered there. It gives us this closest picture of the time of the collapse, and it gives us like contemporary evidence of what the people had experienced when this collapse was actually already happening. So here is one of the letters from the king of Ugarit called Hammurabi to the king of one kingdom in Cyprus called Elashem. And he says, "Behold my father." It means that the king of Cyprus was not actually his father, it's a political relationship. So if he calls him father, it means that he's somehow in a lesser power position than the other king. If they called each other brothers, it meant the kings were more or less equal. And if the king called another king's son, it meant that he felt that he was in a better power position. So it is a political term during this era. So it says, "Behold my father, the ships of the enemy have come. My city was burned to the ground, and they did evil things in my kingdom. Does my father not know that all my troops and my chariots are in the land of Hatti in Turkey, and all of my ships are in the land of Luka, which is the southern part of Turkey? And so the land is abandoned unto itself. Let my father know 7 ships of the enemy came here and did much damage to us." It's an interesting letter because apparently it was never even sent. So they had time to write it in Ugarit, but they did not have time to actually send it to Cyprus. So it is that fresh from the time of this collapse. And there are other texts also that are interesting and taken to this time. So then the collapse happens, and this is a slide I often show my students to sort of draw a picture of what happened. And the way we actually define collapse is as a sudden diminishing of population across multiple sites and the presence of so-called destruction layers in archaeology. And we can see a distinct change in the material culture that follows this time. So there was some disruption in culture, but it doesn't mean that it was like only chaos and war and so on. So this is a bit dramatic, but it was like a period of around 100 years, like one single lifetime during which the world changed fundamentally during this time. And during this time of collapse, there were these widespread migrations of peoples that were caused by famines, rebels and wars, technological changes, especially the weapon technology seems to change during this time. There was mass production of weapons, so they started making these cheaper weapons, especially in southern Europe, that then spread to the eastern Mediterranean from there. There were crises in resources, so especially the tin trade somehow stopped working, was disrupted at this time, and they started making bronze out of, I think, arsenic or something that was of a lesser quality. But not getting any tin was a major problem at this time. There was political unrest, lack of funding, and then climate change and natural disasters have also been thrown into the mix of things that happened during this around 100-year period. But what we see is that the trade relations, they stopped, so they stopped exchanging products across this area, and that there's we do not have texts from the period following the collapse. So this is usually called a dark age, not because it was like not enlightened, but because we don't know a lot about it because we do not have text. So in history, the Dark Age refers to the lack of textual evidence. And then we have these destruction layers. This is also a slide that I often show my students, and the details are not important here. So this is a rough chronology of the three major areas, so Egypt, Anatolia, Turkey, and Mesopotamia. And you may notice that there is something called a dark age, like in all of these areas. So this is like why we talk about this collapse of the world system, because the effects of this disruption were wide. And traditionally, the collapse was blamed on these so-called sea peoples, and this blaming of everything going wrong in the world on the sea peoples actually goes back to ancient Egypt. So already the ancient Egyptians, they blame the world changing, things going wrong on these foreign invaders. They blamed the end of the New Kingdom Empire on these like looters and ruffians who came from somewhere across the sea. And it's a pretty classic thing to do, to blame the outsiders for things going wrong. So it's true that there were migrations during this time, but like not everything that happened can be blamed on these foreigners. There are a lot of theories on what might have caused this disruption of the world system, this domino effect, and a lot of like different factors have been proposed. There's volcanic eruptions, there's earthquakes and earthquake storms. Earthquake storm is like when one earthquake triggers another, so there's a series of earthquakes. There's comets, tidal waves, migrations, pillaging bandits, new technologies, lack of resources, droughts, famines, chasing warfare, breakdown of trade, regional and interregional political crises, and diseases. And when we put all of this together, it becomes this system collapse. And more than likely, it was a combination of different factors, and they affected each other. But obviously, we do not know exactly like what led to what, so what the actual progress of events was during this time. And a personal interest for me is like what the role of singular events was in the breakdown of this world system. So that was this shipwreck found in Ugarit in southern Turkey in the 1980s, and it is one of the best preserved shipwrecks from late Bronze Age. And it was wrecked around like 1300, so over 100 years before this time of the collapse. So it's not like a direct cause of the collapse, but it may have like contributed to things starting to go wrong, because this ship had a lot of materials in it. It had like raw materials and also products. So the shipment that was lost at sea was very, very expensive during this time. And here's the proposed voyage of this ship. So you can see Ugarit, where the ship was wrecked, and more than likely the ship had sailed from Ugarit, because the ships during this time always went in this anti-clockwise direction, like around Cyprus, because of the sea currents. So more than likely Ugarit was the last like major harbor before the wreck. And here's some of the objects that we have found there. You can see here a golden scarab that bears the name of Nefertiti. So this has been used to date the shipwreck. So it means that it cannot have been like before Nefertiti was a thing, was in political power. So it has to be like after her time. So it may have been sunk during the reign of the king Akhenaten, or later, but not earlier than that. And I'm wondering like what the effect of this one shipwreck might have been, because if you remember a few years ago, there was this ship that was like stuck in the Suez Canal for a while, and the effects of this like one ship disrupting world trade were pretty far and wide. So in some ways, I think like economies are still affected by this one ship being stuck there. So it could have like very far-reaching consequences when you go further from the incident. The singular objects, singular events can have these far-reaching consequences. So obviously people have theorized on collapse, and Guy Middleton especially has proposed that there should be this discipline of collapsology to study these different collapses. And they've been studied at least since the time of Plato. Plato was maybe the first person to discuss collapse in a more theoretical way. But usually these historical discussions of collapse in the modern age focus on the Romans and the Mayans, and they focus on these vast territorial empires rather than on this interconnected system that in many ways could be a better analogy for the modern day. So we know about the collapse of Rome, and there are a lot of opinions on what actually happened there, but Rome was an empire and not a similar system as we had in the late Bronze Age. So some of the most famous books that have been written on this are Joseph Painter's The Collapse of Complex Societies, where he presents 11 different models for how societies collapse. Jared Diamond's Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fall and Succeed is like maybe the book that people know about this. It is an ecological model, so he pretty much blames everything on changes in the environment, and has been widely criticized. So I think people even got together and wrote a book as a response to his work. But it is like something that is very well known by the general audience. Then Glenn Forge and John Nichols wrote a book called After Collapse, The Generation of Complex Societies. He tends to like silver line things. So it's that there's always something good that comes from bad. So if you have this collapsing world system, then it leads to something good in the future. And maybe that's sometimes true, but we cannot like generalize that. Then Forsyth edited this book that has a lot of different articles on collapse, and in his edit volume, that's a lot of like interpreting the ancient evidence through the lens of the modern world. So, I think I like looking at analogies between history and the modern day. We shouldn't like read history through the modern lens. And then there's Guy Middleton's Understanding Collapse, Ancient History and Modern Myths, where he describes collapse as this complex phenomenon that's frequently mythologized when we talk about it these days. And it's like people are so focused on these concept of collapse these ages. Well, world systems break down that it chances like collapse for normal being almost. More theory. So again, the details don't really matter here. But Philippe Bourgeard did this graph for the cyclical logic in world systems, and I've highlighted a few things here. So we often have what's hidden up there is climate change or changes in climate. They often lead to demographic growth, which then leads to internal conflicts and war. And what is different, maybe, between the ancient world and now is that now human actions can lead to climate change. So now in the modern world, we're able to affect change in the climate on a global scale, which is what they could not do in the ancient world. So that's one of the differences that we have made this into a kind of loop. But it is a complex process, so you can see here that I am simplifying it quite a lot. What happens then in the times following this so-called Dark Age is that afterwards, in the Iron Age, if you remember the Metal Ages, there are these new societies, new peoples that start emerging, and many of these peoples, like Greeks, Romans, and Hebrews, for example, started building their own identity by projecting their own history and their mythical origins into these dark ages of the past. So in many senses, the Greeks and the Romans and the Hebrews only come to be after the collapse, but they think that their origins were in the so-called Dark Ages. From the few hundred years following the collapse, there are a few literary sources, and there is some continuity in material culture, but in many places we have a new material culture replacing the old. But some of the consequences is that there's an increase in nationalistic thinking, and again, nation is a very problematic word to use in a historical context, but it means that people start thinking about themselves as being people separate from other peoples. So this kind of like us versus them thinking starts increasing when in the late Bronze Age the world was so interconnected that there was less of this like us and them thinking. There are independent city-states, so we've had these great empires or great kingdoms or these like vast areas in late Bronze Age. When it comes to the Iron Age, we have like much smaller players, so people tended to draw inwards and be in their own city and not as much in contact with others. We have the first democracies in the Iron Age. Some people think that the Greeks invented democracy. I think that definitions also have something to do with the development of democracy, but this democratic thinking starts increasing in the Iron Age. There's a new trade network, so definitions, they start trading across the Eastern Mediterranean, and in time they create a trade network that like rivals the one that we have in the Bronze Age, but it took a while for it to develop. There were innovations in metallurgy and military technology, and then there's also something that we see in different areas in the Iron Age is that people started thinking of God in more abstract terms. So monotheisms started emerging, and not just in ancient Israel, but also like the Assyrians had this trend toward thinking about God as a single being, and even in other places you can see this developing. And then there was the adoption of alphabetic writing. So the alphabet is something that was invented in the Bronze Age, but it becomes widely used only in the Iron Age. So a few examples of what we find after the collapse. first of all, there are like many new peoples that seemingly suddenly just arrive on the world stage. And obviously they didn't come from nothing, but because you don't have the lit resources, it is difficult to know like where these new peoples come from. But one of the areas from which we actually have texts is where Ugarit used to be. So there is the Syro-Luwian kingdom called Palestine in the area where Ugarit used to be in the Iron Age, and from there we actually have some texts from this area. So it's not like we have no texts at all, but there are very few texts, and we do know that there was a king called Paiga who lived in this Pulania. Inalua was his capital, and that there's this well, kind of mysterious connection maybe between this kingdom of Palestine and then Philistia in the south. So Philistia or Belecet is one of the peoples who were considered one of these sea peoples. So theory is that the people moved to the Philistine coast following the Bronze Age collapse, and they're like maybe an Aegean people. People are not sure where they came from, but it is somehow different from the material culture that existed in the area before this time. And also between the area of Philistia and Palestine, there is a shared material culture. So we find similar pottery in these two areas, which tells us that there's some kind of connection here that isn't just based on the name. So we do know that the Peleset was a name the Egyptians used of the southern peoples, and then Palestine or Wollaston was a name that these people used of their own kingdom. So there is like this also etymological connection, but also in material culture, they share something. But it is one of the places from which we know something during this sort of like gap between the late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Then one of the major changes is that the Arameans come on the world stage. So the origin of Arameans seems to be nomadic. There were these tribes called the Afama, and the Arameans are thought to be like one of these tribes. But they sort of like in the Iron Age, they become a major player. And the Arameans had mixed societies with Luwians. The Luwians are an actual Bronze Age people, and it seems like their culture continued with the Arameans, because the Arameans intermingled with the Luwians, and then like they preserved their Bronze Age culture into the Iron Age. So we have, for example, some kingdoms where you have like these Luwian names and Aramean names, one after the other, which tells us that the societies were very interconnected. The Aramean script, they started using an alphabetic script, and it actually outlived the people. So even today, like the Arabic script is pretty much based on this script that the Arameans use. And it may be that they wrote more text than we have on this perishable material, but and from southern Mesopotamia, we have some text written on clay tablets, but mostly from the north, we only have these mortuary inscriptions. So again, very few texts that tell us about these Arameans. But there's still a pretty big change that happened in the world. Here's some of the art of these mixed Syro-Luwian or Luwian Aramean kingdoms. So this art style is like very Bronze Age, which these are all examples from the Iron Age, but they retain a lot of like features from Bronze Age art. Then I mentioned the monotheisms. So one of the major changes when we go to from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age is that the central cultic site changes. So in the late Bronze Age, Aleppo had been a very important cultic site. There was a storm god who was worshipped in Aleppo on a wide area. And when we come to the Iron Age, the temple in Aleppo suddenly loses its significance, and then in Ain Dara, another temple becomes a very important center that gathers people from a wide area. And the temple in Ain Dara is known for having these giant footsteps. at the portico of the temple. And these giant footsteps suggest that there was some like abstraction of the deity going on during this time, which may hint at this monotheistic tendency in the Iron Age. So it's the way people thought about gods starts changing, and we see it in like details like this. And then finally, there's the alphabetic writing. So, like I mentioned, the alphabet had been invented like a long time before the Iron Age. So the first text that had been written using an alphabetic text is from the 1800s BC. Sorry, I noticed that I have some Finnish here, so it's EAA means BCE, before the Common Era. So the alphabetic writing was known for a long time, but it wasn't used. So for some reason, it had not become widely used until after the collapse. And it seems like intuitively, like alphabetic writing would be easier than like uniform writing that was used during the Late Bronze Age, but for some reason they did not widely adopt it. So it's only after the collapse in the Iron Age that they started using alphabetic script, and it's probably thanks to the Phoenicians, because they took the script across their trade network, and it's probably because the Phoenicians that we now write using the letters that we do, because both the Arabic and the Latin alphabets are derived from the Phoenician letters. So thank you, Phoenicians. But it took a surprisingly long time for this alphabetic writing to become the predominant writing technology. So if I sum up some of the changes from the Late Bronze Age to the Iron Age, consisted of there having been this centralized power systems in the Late Bronze Age that become atomized governments in the Iron Age. So we have this big empire kingdoms, or whatever they call them, that were centrally controlled. And then when it comes to the Iron Age, we no longer have those big kingdoms that have more like individual different governments. We have very hierarchical societies in the Late Bronze Age, and then in the Iron Age we find these rural settlements where people seem to be a little bit more equal because they don't live in such a large society, so it makes sense that it's not as hierarchical. In the Late Bronze Age there were multiple regional centers, whereas when we come to the Iron Age there start to be these large regional centers, but there are fewer of them. So, for example, Angara becomes one of these large regional centers in the Iron Age. There was a shared material culture in the Late Bronze Age, especially among the elite, whereas in the Iron Age there are regional material cultures. So we see the material cultures being very different across the Iron Age. Well, there's not as much uniformity. And if there was physical uniformity in the Late Bronze Age, then there's individuality that we find in the Iron Age. We have this palace-controlled network in the Late Bronze Age, and it becomes private economic activity in the Iron Age. So there was some private economic activity already in the Bronze Age, but very little. So mostly it was this fiction of the kings trading gifts with each other. That it was the palace that did the trade. So there were some private entrepreneurs also in the Late Bronze Age. Some of them we know by name, but mostly private economic activity only increases in the Iron Age. If the world was international or interregional in the Late Bronze Age, becomes circumscribed in the Iron Age, and the cultural homogeneity becomes cultural fragment in the Iron Age. So these are some changes that we see in the world. And in many ways, the Iron Age world is a precursor to our own world. So many of the things that sort of were invented or came to be in the Iron Age are things that still exist in our world. So there was this break between the Late Bronze Age and the Iron Age. Especially you can see with the writing that we're still writing with the script that started spreading only in the Iron Age. To finish off with, I'll just mention that it is easy to find similarities between us and these historical eras, these bygone worlds. So I like finding analogies between between history and the modern age. But while it's easy to find similarities, it might be important also to ask how we're different from them. And that is something that I invite you to think about. And then also think about what's left of our civilization in 3,000 years, because we live in this age of acceleration. So things seem to happen so fast, changes happen so fast that a similar period between the late Bronze Age and now in the future can be a very, very different world. So that's what I have to say today. Thank you.